Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. My name is Mars, and today you have no idea how glad I am to be back making videos, because man, I've been through technological hell and back to get my computer upgraded, but finally we're there. I lost basically my entire hard drive and all the files on it, and that included my YouTube assets and my Twitch assets, so I get to spend a lot of time rebuilding. So I'm just happy to have a video made. Happy to be back. Thank you for your patience in me getting myself ready to go again. The good news about some computer upgrades means that I'm going to be able to do more in the future, both with streaming and with content creation, so please look forward to that. And yeah. Today's video is very exciting for me because I feel like this question is asked a lot and there's a lot of debate about it. Who is better between CG Nichol, or Maritime Strategist Nichol, I'm just going to call him Nichol in this video, and Zargabaath? Between the two of them, which is the better support unit? Today we're going to dive in and look at the key similarities and differences to help us make that decision. And before anybody ats me in the comments about the way that I pronounce Nichol, okay? Nicole is a girl's name. And I know Nichol looks like a trap, but he is not a girl, so I'm calling him Nichol. Alright, moving right along. Now the first thing we want to look at is their similarities, and this is where they do have a lot of overlap, but in slightly different ways. And initially I decided to color code the winner in each category on this slide with green, and you'll notice there's an awful lot of green because their differences are, like, they're similar in many ways, but the difference between that particular category allows them to have some niche utility. So for example, under elemental resistance coverage, Nichol can cover 4 elements at 70%, or Zargabaath can cover all elements by 40 to 60%. So for them, I gave them a tie, because there are going to be times where you want a wide selection of elemental resistance, and there are going to be some times where Nichol's elemental resistance doesn't apply. But in the times where Nichol's do apply, such as against 3-star Alexander, he's going to be a standout character for that fight. Now it is of course worth noting that Nichol can counter magical damage with a 20% chance of buffing the entire party's magic mitigation, or elemental damage by 40%. Now, I don't really consider that to be amazing since a lot of people run magic tanks these days anyways, and it's not a high proc chance. So personally, I don't really factor that in when preparing for fights. It's basically nothing. So in this case, definitely a tie. If you need higher resistance to particular elements, Nichol wins. If you need a greater selection of elemental resistance, Zargabaath wins. Now when it comes to breaks, they do have completely different options for handling breaks on your party. Of course, these two units do not inflict breaks themselves. They can either remove breaks in the case of Nichol, or they can resist breaks with Zargabaath, but each of them kind of come with a caveat. In Nichol's case, it's activated by his limit burst, which does take a moderate amount of time to build, so you're not always going to be able to remove breaks in fights where they are applied to your party frequently. However, in Zargabaath's case, he has a cooldown called... Wait, what is it called? I always forget, man. I always forget. He's got all these super cool names for his abilities. Prismatic Barrier. Now, Prismatic Barrier applies not only the 60% elemental resistance you see in the category above, but it applies break resistance for your entire party for 3 turns. So, if you know a heavy-hitting threshold attack is coming and you want to keep your party from being broken, it's a smarter way to play it. Resisting breaks is always better than removing it, because then you can preempt it. Like, you don't have to take additional damage from your party while they are broken. Now in the buffs category, both of them top out at 150%. Nichol's 150% is marginally easier to maintain because his limit burst lasts for 3 turns, and his cooldown ability gives you 150%. So that's why I've marked that one as a winner for Nichol and kind of a loss for Zargabaath, because Nichol is a hair easier to maintain the 150 buffs with. Granted, both of them can do 150% buffs with complete uptime. So in that regard, I evaluate Nichol just slightly better out of ease of use, and Zargabaath slightly less in that buffing category. However, it does totally balance out in the next category, which is damage mitigation. Both of them have abilities that they can use on demand that provide 30% mitigation, but that's where the differences, or the similarities, end. Nichol is able to provide 40% mitigation with a cooldown skill, but so can Zargabaath. And in addition to that, Zargabaath's Limit Burst is able to mitigate damage by 50%, which, if you remember our diagram from the party building guide video that I still don't know what to call, you'll remember that damage mitigation is king after, things like elemental resistance or evade or breaks, for example. But that extra 10% mitigation and having that up 100% of the time, that's a really big deal. Because the only thing that Nichol can do 100% of the time is 30% evade or 30% mitigation. He can do 40% sometimes. So in that regard, I definitely put Zargabaath as the winner. And I know a lot of people say, well, Zargabaath's Limit Burst is really hard to fill. And it's like, well, okay. Nichol's is not really a walk in the park either. It's also 40. And I think he has a pretty similar amount of high tide, if not actually a hair lower. He does have some auto limit stuff or whatever, but the argument of his limit burst is harder to maintain doesn't really hold a lot of water to me. Yes, you do have to do it every 2 turns instead of every 3, but it is so worth it. It is so worth the price that you pay for that. Now, one of the other things that each of them can do at 7 stars that they couldn't do previously is they can chain. In Nichol's case, he is able to chain with the Flood family, which includes people like Lulu, Circe, or other units with Flood abilities. Zargabaath is able to chain with Octaslash chainers, which includes people like Sephiroth, Prompto, and Roberta, in addition to several others. In this case, I put Zargabaath ahead of Nichol because he's actually able to substantiate some damage with that if you really wanted to. Even though he doesn't really have passives to back it up, Zargabaath can be built as a true double-hand damage dealer, and he can multicast Octaslash chaining frames, which, you could do some real damage with that. Not that you would ever do that. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And then Flood basically does no damage. As far as damaging skills are concerned, Flood is pretty insignificant, which is why I would consider Zargabaath the better unit in that case. But all in all, you're not going to use those abilities very much. It's just a thing to compare in terms of similarities. Now, moving right along from there, I want to talk about some of the unique advantages that Zargabaath has over Nichol. These are some of the skills that you may consider when choosing which support unit to use a unit of choice ticket on, or which one to take in a fight if you have both of them. One of Zargabaath's most powerful abilities after his awakenings is Rejuvenate +2. Now this ability is fantastic when it's awakened. Not only does it full heal the target, but it also replenishes their MP by 50%. It applies a regen, a very strong one, for 5 turns. It applies an MP refresh for 5 turns, and it applies an 80% re-raise for 5 turns. Now that's a really, really big ability. That's a lot of MP recovered on a single target. It's super helpful for those gas-guzzling damage dealers, such as Grimlord Sakura, or if you're using triple cast Sora, those units that notoriously run through 150 or 200 MP a turn. Zargabaath's got you covered because not only can he heal 50% of their MP in a single turn, but he applies that really big MP refresh. So Rejuvenate +2, I don't think can be overhyped. It is an extremely powerful ability, and if he's used one of his cooldown abilities on a previous turn, he is able to cast it twice on the following or the turn after that as well, depending on the cooldown skill. But anyways, multicastable, full heal, MP 50% heal, just so much goodness put in there, including re-raise. I love it. One of the other things that I really love about Zargabaath, and it kind of couples with his third point, which is evasion, Zargabaath counters magic and physical damage, and he has a 50% chance to counter, which is really, really big. And if you combine that with Zargabaath's innate tankiness, he's going to take quite a few hits. Most party members do, but when Zargabaath gets hit, he's going to clap back. And when he does, it generates a lot of limit burst crystals. And this is especially handy if you combine it with his ability to be an evade tank. Now, Zargabaath is extremely well suited to be a provoke evade tank because he innately has 40% physical evasion, which is huge. That's a ton of evasion. All you need is another 60%, throw a Moogle plushie on him, and that guy's got you covered for provoke evade tanking. And if he's tanking, he's countering half of the time he's countering and dealing damage, and it's not for the damage, but it's more for the limit burst crystal fill, and I consider it to be superior to some of the LB fill options that Nichol has. It's extremely helpful, very, very nice. To be able to combine a support unit with an evade tank is super uncommon, and so the fact that you're able to do both in a single unit, amazing. Now the last point I put on here is Rar, which is, he has a Berserk ability, which is really cool. It is called Berserk Crest, and it buffs the attack of the target by 150%, and this is not a skill you're going to use a lot, but it is one that makes Zargabaath different. This attack buff stacks on top of other attack buffs, meaning that you can get an excess of, the 150% that you get from his limit burst. You throw on Berserk Crest, and then now the target has 300% attack buff. This is basically only handy if you're going for one-shot strategies or you're trying to burst a boss or an enemy down. Not the most handy, but it is there, and it is extremely amusing to use. So those are some of the things that really helps Zargabaath be a standout individual, as well as just his innate tankiness. I really like. He's got a few other fringe things that you can cover using Nichol's kit as well, such as stop resistance with if you decide to do Arcadian Crest plus or Arcadian Light +2. Handful of little things like that. Super, super handy, very flexible kit. Excellent, excellent, excellent. I love him. Now, let's talk a little bit about Nichol's unique advantages. At 7 stars, he was brought some interesting things that make him extremely useful. Whereas Zargabaath's kit focuses on individual units and filling up their HP or their MP or helping them out as individuals, Nichol is somebody who plays for the party. Now, he has a passive that grants a chance to provide limit crystals to the entire party, and it's not a ton, but it is there, and it can come in handy. In addition to that, he is able to buff crystal fill rate with some of his skills. He can also just add more crystals to the party's limit gauges. That's handy. He's really good at helping everybody to fill their limit bursts. In addition to that, his what is it called? I always forget. His Magic Restorative Stance is an extremely handy skill because it only costs 10 MP and it restores MP 40 to all allies. And he can multicast that. He can do 2 of those, so it restores 80 MP to the entire party and it gives him a net of 60 to himself. And that's super handy for Osmos situations where your party gets leached of their MP. He's able to recover it extremely inexpensively, and that's definitely an advantage he has over Zargabaath's Rejuvenation +2. Rejuvenation, I think, costs 75 MP, which is significantly more than Nichol's 20 MP to cast it twice. So extremely handy for fights that give you Osmos, because Nichol innately has a ton of MP. You can build him for a ton of MP and a lot of spirit, and most of the time if your entire party is getting Osmosed, Nichol will be left standing with plenty of MP to help get your team back on track. So in that regard, I think Nichol is awesome. Now, a new trick that he got at his 7 stars is an ability called Water Infusion that allows him to imbue a single ally with water for 3 turns. This is super handy for true double-hand damage dealers that are using 2-handed weapons with damage variants, because it's a great way to dramatically increase your outgoing damage. The drawback of this, of course, is that he cannot multicast it, which means that he's going to have to spend 2 separate turns applying it to 2 different damage dealers if you're chaining them. And it only lasts for 3 turns, which means that if you want to use him in a buffing and imbuing rotation, he basically has 1 turn to buff, and then the 2 following turns he will imbue, and then he has to buff again. So he can do it, and he can certainly do it better than Ignis. He can, do buffs, and he can do imbues, but I don't know. It's one of those things where you gotta have a specific strategy in mind. I don't think you're gonna have as much widespread use for it, but in the situations where it makes sense and where it is useful, it's gonna be extremely impactful. Now, one of the other things that is definitely worth noting about Nichol is that 2 of his cooldown abilities fill the evocation gauge by 2 to 4 orbs, which on average is going to give you half of an Esper gauge. And this is a big deal because there are a lot of missions out there that require you to summon Espers, but you may not always have the opportunity to bring a summoner unit in your party. This allows you to help get some extra evocation gauge filled. Super, super handy. I really like this about him because sometimes getting those summon orbs can be a giant pain. He definitely takes the pain out of it, makes it much easier. So for each of these units, I've prepared some win conditions because they are definitely different units. I know this video is about wins, but I want to talk about when each of them wins over the other, and then we'll come up with the king of the castle. All right, so in Nichol's case, Nichol will win if enemies inflict water, ice, light, or dark damage because of his ability to resist those elements by 70% for the entire party. Super handy. If that's something that you need on your party, is that resistance, Nichol is there for you, and he's going to make it easier for you than Zargabaath would. He's also a better AoE MP battery. He can take care of the MP needs of the entire party much more easily than Zargabaath can. I will note that I feel like this is not a very common need, especially with the availability of personal MP refresh items. I feel like most of my party is fine on MP. I think most of the time it's my damage dealers who need it the most, and they need it a lot. So, you know, if your entire party needs it, Nichol's got you covered. Nichol also wins if you need to do a summon, because he really does help with those Esper orbs, and because his breaker removal is not limited to a cooldown skill, he may be a better option when dealing with enemies that break frequently. Now, of course, the problem is his break removal is linked to his limit burst, which is a little bit of a bummer, but not the end of the world. All right, if you know a lot of breaks are coming, you can prepare for it, and because it's not stuck behind a cooldown, you are able to remove breaks as necessary as long as you have entrusters or things like that that can help you use that limit burst frequently. Now, Zargabaath, on the other hand, he's going to win if your opponents use many different elements. If they don't use the ones that Nichol can buff resistance to, or if they use more than those ones. If the enemy uses many different elements, Zargabaath can cover all of them. So that's definitely an upgrade. If enemies deal a high amount of damage, Zargabaath is also going to win because that extra mitigation for the entire party is going to make a phenomenal difference. Having 50% up 100% of the time as opposed to 30 to 40%, you are going to notice a survivability difference on your party. Now, I alluded to this when talking about Nichol. If you have one or two party members that need a lot of MP, or if they need re-raise, so if you know your tank is the only person who needs re-raise, or if you have damage dealers like A2 who, when they're double handing, they can go through over 100 MP a turn, Rejuvenate +2 has you covered. Such an amazing ability. If that's what you need on one or two party members, Zargabaath has you covered. And then, of course, Zargabaath is the vastly superior option if you need an evade tank, because he can combine the buffing, the mitigation, the resistance, so many different excellent things in tandem with evade tanking. So if those conditions are met, then Zargabaath is going to be your winner in terms of support, and because of a few of those things, that's why I have to place Zargabaath as the overall winner. Now, some to say Nichol is bad. I do have to say as a caveat that the margin by which I'm placing Zargabaath over Nichol is like microscopically small. It is very, very small. Zargabaath is only marginally better than Nichol, and the reason that I believe that is because Rejuvenate +2 is extremely powerful. For mid to late tier players, this is going to be a bread and butter skill for you, because you know you're going to have those really big damage dealers. You want to roll up in there with a ton of MP, a ton of magic, or a ton of attack. You don't want to bother with MP refresh skills. This is going to keep those units topped off. It lasts for 5 turns. Huge, huge, huge. It also supplies a re-raise, because we know a lot of times our damage dealers are not as tanky. This honestly facilitates you to show off, and it really is awesome. Now, the next reason I have to place him as a winner is because of that 50% damage mitigation. It really does make such a huge difference with your party survival, especially if you're able to layer additional mitigations over top of it. Nichol really can't compete in terms of damage mitigation. You know, he can get pretty close with 40% on a cooldown, 30% otherwise, but Zargabaath also has a button he can push that gives 30% all the time, and, you know, I don't know. I don't think it's that special. Now, this last point that I give Zargabaath over Nichol is just a very, very tiny point, and it's that break resist is slightly better than break removal in this case. Now, most fights, the boss is not going to sit there and just break you over and over and over and over again. If you're familiar with the fight, you can usually anticipate when breaks are coming, or high elemental attacks, and this is where his prismatic barrier comes in because it covers elemental resistance and it covers break resistance. If you know when those things are coming, you can be smart about when you activate it, and you can get the full benefit from it. And yeah, I would suppose if there's a fight where a boss is spamming breaks on your party anyways, you can either ignore them, you can re-raise through them, you can even buff through them, because we talked about this in that other video. There's, the diagram of things that influence your damage, okay? Buffs mean less than anything else, so, being able to just not deal with having breaks on your party by resisting it, I think it's handy. But again, not a huge deal. I think Rejuvenate +2 is what makes Zargabaath unique and more powerful than Nichol, in conjunction with that 50% mitigation. But again, keep in mind, Nichol is an amazing unit. He offers so many powerful abilities, and he's just awesome. Like I said, it's basically the difference of Nichol playing for the party, Zargabaath playing for himself, or his BFFs. He plays that one-on-one game versus Nichol, who wants to give some buffs and benefits to everybody. So that's basically how I'd evaluate them. They are close enough that I consider them to be on pretty much equal footing. These are just the tiny situations in which I would choose one unit over the other, and this is essentially the reason why I pick Zargabaath over Nichol in most situations. But yeah, that's just my opinion on this. Now, a quick pointer on Zargabaath. I know it is absolutely worth mentioning that one of the drawbacks of Zargabaath is that his limit burst is quite difficult to fill. The same thing applies to Nichol, but it's not as much of a drawback if you don't have Nichol's limit burst available. But for Zargabaath, your party's gonna live and die on having that available. Keep in mind that when it comes to filling Zargabaath's limit burst, you can dual wield short swords or fists, and you need an equip fist materia or equip short sword materia, both of which are quite easy to get. And then you can equip high tide weapons into his hands, which gives him 200% limit burst fill rate. In addition to that, you can equip any other auto limit or limit burst fill rate items, and they will combine very well with his counters, which help him to fill his own limit burst very quickly. So if you have him built with enough high tide, and even budget players can get him to over 300 or even 400% high tide without buffs, you can buff him with eccentric to bring him up to 600. You can even use his limit burst every other turn without having to use Entrust or party limit fill. So that's just my take on it. And the same principle applies to Nichol. You can equip a couple of high tide daggers from Item World on Nichol, no problem. That'll get you 200% high tide, and then you can equip other high tide stuff, same as you would Zargabaath. Both of them do use their limit burst quite a lot, so that's a technique that I would apply to both of them. So with that, the competition is over. Zargabaath wins by hair. He looks definitely much cooler. CG Zargabaath win. And that's my rationale behind it. That's why for me, I use Zargabaath all the time. It's why his limit burst is worth leveling. And yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Both of the units are super, super useful. I enjoy both of them. Very cool. I see different situations where I would use one over the other. Let me know in the comments below, and let me know what you would like to see in the next video, and that is where I will see everybody next time.